The police car lights flashed red and blue as officers moved slowly toward the house. Inside, a man named Gary sat very still. He looked like an ordinary worker. He had a small, quiet face. He had never looked like the scary picture people sometimes imagine when they hear the word serial killer. That was the most shocking part. A man who had lived quietly for years, working in factories, talking to neighbors, and raising a family, was suddenly the center of the biggest hunt the city had ever seen. When the officers told him he was under arrest, his face did not change much. He put his hands behind his back. A badge was shown. The door closed. Cameras flashed. People who had followed the case for a long time felt a huge rush of relief and fear at the same time. Relief that someone might finally be stopped. Fear because for years many people had been hurt, and now some answers might come too late. That was a loud, top-of-the-story moment. The arrest. It made people gasp because it meant the puzzle that had lasted decades might finally have a name on it. But to really understand how the city reached that moment, we must go back to the start and trace the small, quiet pieces that built the big story. We will look at small events and small clues, and see how a man could hide in plain sight for so long. The area where the crimes happened was by a green river that ran near highways and little neighborhoods. Years ago, people walked along the river. They fished. They drove their cars on the nearby roads. They lived normal lives with work and school and pets. In that same place, before people knew what was happening, some women went missing. At first, people thought they had run away. Some had problems in their lives. Families worried. The police checked, but sometimes had few clues. The world can be unfair, and sometimes people get lost in it. Detectives began to notice a pattern. Many of the missing people worked at night or in hard jobs, and some had trouble in life. They were people that some others treated as unimportant. That made the search slower, because when someone looks unimportant, fewer people notice right away. But the detectives did notice. They pinned things on a board, names, dates, places where the women were last seen. When many small dots are put on a map, sometimes a line appears. Years passed. More women were found in places hidden near the river. The discovery made the city tremble. Families mourned. People felt angry that bad things could happen so quietly. The detectives were sad and worried. They promised to find the person who caused harm. The detectives worked many small hours. They looked at old case files and re-examined evidence people had found before. In the early days, the police had jars of small items. Pieces of clothing, a shoelace, a note, or a broken button. These items were stored carefully. At the time, the science to read tiny clues was not as strong as it would be later. But when science grew stronger, the old jars of evidence could be tested again. That is an important idea. Sometimes the answer is sleeping in a box until we get better tools to wake it. One of the tools that would change everything was DNA testing. DNA is like a secret code that lives in every person's body. It is found on skin, hair, and small bits left behind. Many years after the first cases, science learned how to read smaller pieces and match them to people. When detectives used DNA testing, they could sometimes say, "This small piece comes from this person." That power is careful and must be used right, but it can help solve mysteries that were once unfixable. The detectives saved every tiny piece of evidence. They kept it in cool, safe places so the science lab could check it later. They also wrote notes about who saw what and when. Those notes looked boring on their face, but they were clues. They showed who was near a certain road at a certain time, who had spoken to someone late at night, who had come and gone. Gary worked for many years in factories that made things. He had jobs, and he had a quiet life. He married, and he and his wife had children. He waved at neighbors. He bought groceries. He looked ordinary. But detectives later learned that being ordinary is sometimes the very best way to hide. People look past ordinary faces. They do not think, maybe he did something wrong. They think of soccer games, grocery stores, and birthday cakes. That is how someone can hide in plain sight. As the years went by, detectives began to use new tricks. They used search dogs that could smell what the human nose misses. They used computers to stamp dates and places and to find patterns. They made lists and compared files. Officers who worked that case did not give up. Some of them grew older, but they kept pushing. They learned new science and new ways to ask questions. Sometimes small, unimportant facts turn out to be very important. For example, a witness might say they saw one person drive a certain car near the river. Another witness might remember a man with paint on his shoes. These facts alone do not mean much, but when dozens of small facts are put together, they draw a picture. Detective Tom, who worked on the case for many years, liked to say, "We stitch small things together until cloth shows a shape." People in the town had long memories. A neighbor might remember seeing someone who seemed odd. Maybe a man who stopped and looked at the women who walked by. People whispered in diners. Some tried to warn the police. Other people did not want to make trouble. That made the detectives' job harder. But the detectives followed every small lead. As time passed and science improved, DNA testing began to show that the same person had left traces at different places. That idea gave detectives hope. It meant they were looking at one person, not many unrelated incidents. It was a pattern of a single hand, a single stranger working in the night. The detectives use a new method called linkage analysis. This method is fancy, but the idea is simple. It looks for repeated ways of doing things. If a person always leaves a wrapper or always uses the same color shoe, it is a clue. Sometimes the same small thing reconnects cases that once seemed separate. That is what happened here. The detectives made posters. They asked the public to call in with any small memory. They put telephone numbers on the TV and in the paper. They wanted to find the person who had been hiding. Over the years, thousands of people called with tips. Many tips were dead ends. Some were helpful. One of the helpful tips pointed to a man who drove a certain green truck and worked at a place near the river. The name on the tip seemed small, but it mattered. At the same time, detectives noticed that a man fitting a certain description had been seen in many places near the river at many times. He sometimes had paint on his shoes, which could mean he worked near painted surfaces or in jobs with paint. He sometimes walked slowly along the edge of parking lots. Such habits can be boring in a person's life, but they are gold to an investigator. The police watched files and found that this same man had once been interviewed but then let go because there was not enough proof. Letting people go happens in police work when there is not enough evidence. But the detectives kept the name in a file because small things can add up later. One night, a new idea came up. Forensic scientists had learned more about how to test old evidence. They could now read tiny pieces of DNA from old items in the boxes. So detectives opened the boxes again and sent items to the lab. The lab matched tiny bits of DNA from different evidence jars and found the same code. That code matched a man who had worked in the area for years. The detectives compared it to the name they had kept in a file for years. Gary. The match did not happen in 1 second. It was slow and careful work. The lab sent notes. Investigators checked where Gary had lived and where he had worked. They watched his movements and compared them to the times when women had gone missing. The pieces lined up in a way that looked too strong to be an accident. When the detectives had enough evidence, they had to make a choice: arrest a man and risk being wrong, or wait more and risk him harming more people. They chose to act. The decision was heavy because the cost of being wrong is high, and the cost of being slow might be higher. They planned a careful arrest. They wanted to take him without hurting anyone and to keep evidence safe. The team practiced a move like a small play: who would stand where, who would take the door, who would check the garage. They used plain clothes so neighbors would not panic. When the day came, the officers knocked on the door and Gary answered. He looked normal. He opened the door and the officers politely said he was under arrest. He did not run. He did not argue loudly. He put his hand behind his back and asked quietly, "Why?" That question was small but heavy. It was a question everyone had asked for a long time. How had this been hidden so long? As the officers led him away, they felt many things. Relief that the person might be stopped, sadness of the families who had waited, and surprise that someone so ordinary could hide such a terrible secret. Outside, cameras flashed. People who had followed the case for decades watched the scene and thought of the many small clues that had been stitched together like a quilt. At the end of this chapter, before we move on, something sharp happened that raises another big question. When detectives searched the places Gary had lived and worked, they found small items hidden in spots where a person might not look. A scrap of cloth, a tool, and other things that could link him to the victims. The discovery was an extreme event because it made the case stronger and more real than ever. It also made the town shiver because it showed how close the danger had been to everyday life. The chapter stops here on that sharp event. There is more to learn. How the evidence was used in court, how families found answers, and how people tried to heal. When you are ready, I will continue Chapter 2 and tell you what happened next.